And we're going to go ahead and have a presentation for the love of Kenmore from our guest tonight, Peter Kageyama.
Mr. Mayor. Yeah, Your Honor, do you mind if I say a few words?
Please.
Okay, thanks. I hope you don't mind this tight little roundtable format. It's to facilitate, just a good, intimate conversation, but still be a public meeting as well. And as you know, I was able to attend the City Managers Conference last year and went to a lot of good classes, but the best one, and the one that I really took home with me, was Peter Kageyama's keynote address to the city managers. And it resonated so well with me that I even was able to get a copy of that keynote address from the ICMA conference with Peter's permission. And I showed it to you and to my coworkers soon thereafter. And that was a few months ago. And I think all 7 of you saw that video. You were all here. He's going to do a little refresher, so he's not going to show you that, go through that whole presentation, but he's going to remind you of a few things we talked about. But you know, this creating this happy city, this city where our citizens are proud and happy to be here because they love their city. And one of the reasons they love their city is because they're engaged and they make a contribution. And Peter's going to talk all about that tonight and talk about some ways that we can help facilitate that and how we as a city can avoid being a squelcher of fun. So Peter, take it away.
Just one little housekeeping. We are live, right? We're streaming. Yes. Okay.
So use the microphone is what you're saying.
Yep.
So, folks at home, I can do it. Okay, there we go. Even better. Thank you. Well, I think what we'll be able to do here is also, now I've spent a little bit of time here in your city. I've seen some things. We might actually have a few kind of specific things to maybe even talk about. Some of your future plans and some of the spaces around here as well, which I kind of think maybe makes this a little bit more, even more interesting. So what I thought we would do is I'd remind you of like who I am. I'm the guy who talked about the potholes. Remember that? I talk about the fact that, you know, you get no love for fixing potholes, no emotional return on investment for fixing potholes. Yet clearly, you know, cities are fundamentally sort of in the business of fixing potholes. We, you know, citizens complain about them, and then you as the city have to fix them, of course. And I'm sure all of you, at some point, you have been accosted in the supermarket, in a restaurant, in church, and they know you're on council and says, "Hey, there's a pothole on this particular street," and they kind of expect you to get on the pothole emergency line to fix that particular pothole, almost like right then and there. Because the pothole is the obvious pain point for citizens. You know, there's a hole in the road, somebody needs to fix it, right? And our citizens know to ask for us to fix these potholes, but they don't necessarily know to ask for some of the other things that we as leaders in a community, we kind of need to sort of get out in front of that. And the things that I'm talking about are things like beauty and art and great design. And these are things that citizens, once they've experienced them, they kind of go, how did I ever live without them? But until then, sometimes, you know, the obvious thing is like, well, they know the pain points and then they know the potholes. So again, leadership is sometimes knowing, you know, of course, is hearing what our citizens are asking for, but also intuiting what we know at heart they probably want and need as well. And I talk about building this better city, and you have to meet the minimum threshold requirements. Remember, it has to be functional, it has to be safe. But that in and of itself is not going to make a great city. It is not going to make a lovable city. It's not even going to make a memorable city, because, you know, if it is just about paved roads, police, and fire service, then all cities somewhat become equal, and that's clearly not the case. So I talk about the things that we actually do want in our cities, like comfort, conviviality, which means our city maybe facilitates bringing us together, connecting us with our fellow citizens. I talk about, you know, cities being interesting, and ultimately about cities being fun. The question, where's the fun, is a really interesting one, because it changes the way we think about a problem. You know, if you're, you know, and all of us, we are in, you know, always in those meetings when we're wrestling with some significant, you know, big, hairy problems. And those, and those require us to be conscientious. They require us to be smart. And I don't say this to be sort of, you know, smart-ass about this, but it'd be interesting if more of us, you know, in the context of those meetings, would stop and ask the question, where's the fun? Because when you do that, you actually sort of flip the dynamic in the room and the way people are approaching the problem. You know, we get very serious and we get very technically oriented. But when we ask this question and when we reorient towards some of the higher goals, like fun, we might actually come up with some better solutions beyond a merely technically sufficient. So I try to remind folks all the time to ask, where's the fun? The things that we do love about our places are small things and intimate things. And in my book, I liken them to the idea of these handwritten notes that go with the gift. It's the love note. It's this small thing that has an outsized impact on the way we feel about our places. And these love notes are things that cities will give to citizens, and cities, if they're lucky, citizens might be inclined to give back as well. So it is those small gestures that we do for our citizens that I think actually punch well above their weight. And certainly from a return on investment standpoint, these things don't have to cost much money at all, yet they can obviously have a very significant impact on the way we feel about this, our places. And I almost always show this one when I talk specifically with cities and city leadership. So this was a couple years ago in West Palm Beach, Florida. I was getting the windshield tour there with the mayor. And as we drove past this one building, it was sort of being renovated, and it looked like they were announcing that they were almost ready to open. And they had this sign out there. So I asked the mayor to stop, and we walked up to there and says, "Thank you, city, we have the permits." And I asked the mayor, says, "Are they being snarky about this?" Because, think about it, it seems like it could be kind of like, "Oh, thanks, we actually have the permits now." No. And the mayor said, "No, they're actually very grateful to the city." And I said, "Well, there's got to be a story behind that." And she goes, "Well, there is." She said a couple years before, when she'd run for mayor, one of the platforms she'd run on was the promise to sort of rethink the permitting process, because she said that she'd heard over and over again from the business community there in West Palm Beach what a huge pain in the ass their permitting department had become. And she said, "This is a problem. If this is our reputation amongst the business community, then we need to address this." So she said, "Look, if I get elected, I will look into this and I'll fix it." And when she was elected, she looked at it, she studied the problem, realized it required some different leadership. She changed leadership, cleaned a little house, and changed the culture of the permitting department. And in fact, it's like a complete 180 to the point now where citizens in the business community is actually thanking them for the permits. And I thought that's a really interesting example of one of those times when the citizens give that little love note back to the city. I mean, it's always nice when people will thank staff and thank the city for the hard work that we do. But to go out of your way to actually print up a sign and do something very demonstrable like that actually says that, wow, they must have had a really good experience. Or they, in the past, they obviously had maybe had a really bad experience, and that this was so radically different from what the city had become or the city had evolved into, that they thought this is worth thanking them for. And I thought this is an interesting, sort of conundrum. It's like, what would it take for some citizens to maybe thank you guys for some of the hard work that you guys do? What would it take to sort of go above and beyond their expectations around that? And that's maybe not even a bad goal to have. It's like, how do we get our folks to say, a heartfelt thank you? What's it going to take to get beyond sort of just the, sort of the base level of service to maybe another level of service where we have a different potential outcome that does create some emotional resonance with our citizens? I talk a little bit about love notes like murals. And we all love murals because murals actually, usually they're covering up, fairly ugly walls or ugly buildings there as well. And most of us, while we appreciate murals, not many of us have any sort of appreciable artistic talent that might actually, allow us to go and paint one of these murals. So the folks in Ludington, Michigan, they're on the west coast of Michigan. This past summer, they commissioned an actual artist to come in and sort of lay out the design on this, and sort of in a paint by numbers fashion, they invited folks to come down over the weekend and to paint, to grab a color and a number and to paint the mural. Now, as murals go, this is maybe not terribly high art, but it is highly interactive art. It's the kind of public art that people have a different relationship with than maybe the beautiful mural maybe on the wall that we look at appreciatively. But this one, when we look at, we go, hey, I helped paint that. And that changes the nature of the relationship that people have with it. So if there's ways to do some public art, if there's ways to do some of the things that we're talking about here, where folks can actually pitch in and roll up their sleeves, get a little dirty, have some fun, they will feel very different, very, connected to something like that. Could it be some groundbreaking? Could it be some clearing of stuff? I mean, certainly when people, when we clean up our neighborhoods, we feel better about them. But maybe there's some interesting ways, some creative ways that we could actually engage people in an artistic and creative process as well. Dog parks are love notes, and I talk a lot about the importance of dog parks. And these are one of those small things that have, very, very big outsized impacts by comparison. And I know I was talking with Rob that you guys are in the process of discussing, the first dog park for the city. I think that's great because dog parks are going to be, your dog park will ultimately be one of the most social places in the entire city because people will talk to each other at the dog park. And I think the location of the dog park actually, makes a difference. And I know one of the places being discussed is maybe a little bit more remote, which would be fine for the dog folks. They will find the dog park, they will appreciate it. But if you really want a dog park to actually have sort of, I think, maximum impact, where it's going to impact not only the dog owners, but the community as a whole, you've got to find some other places for it. And I think it's got to be sort of here in the core of this emerging core of your city. And in fact, I think that would be a pretty good place for a dog park. And we were just talking about that, and I asked Rob, says, do people really use this space? He says, no, not really. It's not, it just doesn't have the right feel. It's, and maybe it doesn't have the other amenities around it. Maybe once the town green is done, across the street and more activity is happening here, more people move in, and the apartments up the hill, maybe this does become a little bit more active. But I think that has the makings potentially of a great location for a dog park. And one of the things we might consider doing is doing it on a temporary basis. Get some inexpensive fencing to put it up over the summer. It doesn't even have to take up the entire space. But let people sort of come and have that experience, see if they like it, see if they use it, see if it changes the dynamic and the relationship that people have with City Hall. I can almost guarantee you it will. To bring some folks down here around that. So something to consider there. And then this one was, I remember I talked about the importance of breaking rules, and I point this one out there as well. The guy who hung up signs in downtown Raleigh. And he wasn't allowed to do that. But the people in the city had this very positive reaction to it. And the whole idea behind it was he was trying to start a conversation in his city about the merits of walking. And the reason I showed you this is because I think there's something I probably didn't, I'm almost sure I didn't show last year there at ICMA, so you wouldn't have seen this. And I remember I mentioned that, there's certain people who are really good rule breakers. And I say young people are great rule breakers and risk takers. And certainly I think also artists are as well. So your artistic community becomes these very interesting folks who can help challenge our notions about how things are done. And I wanted to share this one, and I know this you didn't see last from the ICMA thing. This is ArtPrize. This is Grand Rapids, Michigan. And ArtPrize happens every fall. It's been going on for about the last 6 years. So in 2012, an artist approached ArtPrize, says, hey, I've got this idea. I want to do these Chinese lanterns. And the ArtPrize folks says, well, there's fire involved in that. He says, oh, yeah, but, we're only going to do 2,000 of them. And they actually explain how they're designed. And it's actually a lot safer than you would think. So they said, all right, 2,000. They took the idea to the city, to the fire marshal, and they said, well, okay, 2,000 of them, and they signed off on it. So come the event there in 2012, the artist actually launches 20,000 of these. And you can see that 2,000 would have been really impressive, but 20,000 is quite spectacular. And the folks there in Grand Rapids, they said it was one of the most memorable nights that they could ever remember in their city. They said it was stunningly beautiful. And I actually asked the folks from the city, I said, well, what was sort of your official response? I said, well, in the future, we probably ask some more questions. Says we might not allow it, in the future, but they said privately, says we thought it was awesome, and they were so glad that it actually happened. So, again, it sort of points out that sometimes the rules, get bent, and again, artists are oftentimes the really good ones to sort of break that. And isn't that just spectacular? Yeah, pretty amazing. I talked about garden hose solutions. Remember the fact that we overthink the solutions to our city's problems. That instead of going out and doing the splash pad when maybe we don't have enough money for it, we could actually go down to Home Depot, buy a garden hose, turn on the faucet, and let the kids play in that. The garden hose solution is a really creative way to address some of our problems. It's not the final solution, but it's a good interim step, and it's the kind of solution that we actually should get a lot of credit for. when we don't have all the money that we'd like, but we're still trying and we're coming up with, sort of creative solutions that advance the cause for our community. So, in addition to the where's the fun, asking ourselves that question, what's our garden hose solution that gets us down the road on some of the work that we're trying to do as a great sort of interim step. And I talked about small things. I remember I talked about the mice on Maine, these little brass mice in Greenville, South Carolina, that a high school student had suggested the project. These little mice that people sort of go around and find sort of as a scavenger hunt as they explore downtown Greenville. And I talked about that as being one of those surprising and delightful kinds of things. That moment of discovery when you see one of those mice, you can't help but smile. And I talk about the big things like the big blue bear in Denver. Again, clearly very memorable and one of those love notes that people, they take those photos, they smile, and they will always associate that with Denver. And I talk about the value of those kinds of things. And those are hard oftentimes for cities to justify, because people want to hold your feet to the fire about the cost, because they say that we could fill an awful lot of potholes for the cost of that bear. And I guess that's technically true. But I remind folks that things have value, and they have a value beyond the purely financial, and the bear clearly has, value in that smile, in that memorability, in all of those photos that go out there, across the internet, that every one of them is a postcard, is a little love note from the city of Denver. And when your mayor picked me up yesterday, he asked me if there was anything I really wanted to see. I said, well, I kind of want to see the troll. And I had heard of the troll, and some folks had told me about the troll, but I really wanted to see it there in person, and it's quite wonderful. And it's one of those really memorable things that people are going to associate with Fremont and Seattle. And I guess the story behind it is this is over 25 years old now. And the whole impetus behind this was that at the time, there was some fairly antisocial behavior that was going on underneath the bridge at the time. And rather than maybe, more surveillance equipment, more police, and all that kind of stuff, they said, what if we built a giant troll under there? And I'm sure that was a slightly different approach that people were probably fairly skeptical of at the time. But it's clearly had that effect. I mean, now it's one of those things that everybody knows about. It draws people, it draws visitors there all the time, and the last thing you want to do is mess around with the troll that lives under the bridge. So yesterday it was packed with people. It was really impressive. Obviously a beautiful day there, and again quite memorable. But Mayor Baker said, well, as long as we're here in Fremont, you got to see the Lenin statue, because Seattle and Lenin just seem to go naturally hand in hand. I have no idea why, but it's certainly very memorable, quite dramatic there. And then, of course, the rocket. Because cities need rockets, and they certainly need these kinds of memorable things. And the fact that there are planets that have sort of been erected around the rocket as well, I think that's a great theme. That's the kind of thing that obviously makes people smile, and it goes back to that notion of surprise and delight. And there is a lot of value, I think, in these kinds of things. That's often hard to quantify. Sometimes hard to explain to people until they've seen it, and you look at it and you go, yeah, I get it now. So that's the kind of thing that I think we as leaders in the community, we have to be willing to fight for as well, because sometimes our citizens don't necessarily fully understand these things until they've had that experience. So in talking about sort of building these more lovable cities, the next natural step is like, okay, if you buy into this idea, then how do we do it? And that's kind of what my new book is actually about. I think I call it sort of the how-to manual, how we put these ideas into play. And so with that, I thought what we would do is this is all sort of the new material, if you will. And do you remember my friend Devon Jones that I talked about in the thing? He's the archetypal co-creator there. He's the creative director of a little black box theater in downtown St. Petersburg where I live. And he's one of those people that makes our city a better place to live, work, and play. And he doesn't show up on any traditional org chart. He's not one of the most powerful, most influential business people. But we know how important Bob is to our community. And all of you know your community's versions of Devon Jones. I met half a dozen of them earlier this afternoon. folks who are just doing amazing things, not because they're paid to, but this is just sort of how their sense of community and how their sense of creativity manifests with that. So I have maybe a pretty good place to start, and I think we actually started this process here today, but for those playing a little catch-up here. So what I had suggested here is I think we need to identify these folks, and actually Rob kind of took it upon himself to invite some of these people into the room, the obvious co-creators. And I wanted us to bring them together like we did, and I think we got to ask them for their help, which is a different conversation, because usually people come to you guys because you guys have the resources. So they come to you for access to those resources, and they ask you for your help. This flips it around, and we are asking citizens to maybe do something a little bit different, and that's kind of an interesting ask, because if I'm a citizen and I'm asked that, it's like I'm kind of flattered. At the very least, I'm curious, and I'll take that meeting. It's like, oh, the city wants me to help. It's like, okay, well, let's talk about that. I think that's a really interesting notion. And I think what we are actually trying to do is amplify what these folks are naturally doing. The best thing about the co-creators in your community is you don't have to start them on anything. They're already doing this stuff. And what you're really hoping to do is sort of hitch your wagon to their star and maybe, amplify what they're doing, maybe even sort of help nudge some of what they're doing, maybe in a direction that you guys, and something you guys are already working on to maybe even make that even better. I want us to maybe think about providing some other resources, not necessarily money. There's all kinds of resources that we have access to as the city, not the least of which is our expertise in how to get stuff done, to work with our permitting department, with the insurance folks, with the events, how to get the police, arranged to do an event, any of that kind of stuff. All of that is absolutely a resource. And then there's other things. And I suggest that maybe one of the things we might want to consider is letting our community play with some of our toys. And the example that struck me about this was there's a little community not too far from St. Petersburg where I live called Dunedin. And the Parks and Recreation Department in Dunedin had, several years before, they had bought this inflatable outdoor movie screen, like 3 stories tall. Very cool. So they do movies in the park, maybe half a dozen times a year. For the other 51 weeks or so out of the year, it basically sits in storage. And I had suggested to them, well, what if you were to make that available to your creative community? What would those folks do with this stuff? And it's like, and ask yourselves, like, whoa, you mean I could do movies in the park? I could do movies in my backyard? I could do movies on the roof? Sure, why not? And, what the requirement is, just make sure, bring it back intact. Okay. So, the last thing you as the city necessarily want to do is take on more projects, to stretch, staff even further. But sometimes it's not even, you're not taking on a project. Basically, again, you're letting someone else play with your toys. And I know maybe that the risk managers and the city attorney will have, something to say about that as well. But there's ways to make this happen. So maybe think about that. And that, I think, is a natural resource that we could actually provide. And I think the next logical step is after you've had that first meeting with these co-creators is you want to invite them back, a few months later. Say, hey, remember that meeting we had, a few weeks ago or a few months ago? Well, let's sit down again. I'd like to, check in with you guys. And by the way, bring a friend. Because these co-creators are going to know other folks that maybe you guys need to get to know as well. Some of the obvious folks you already know, but the next layer, the next level, the future, the next generation of co-creators, the ones who are already doing this stuff, they have a pretty good idea who they might be, and those are good people for you guys to know. And I think we expand the circle. Those 8 people we met with today, a few months from now they become 16. A few months from then it becomes 32. So all of a sudden now you've sort of exponentially increased the number of people who are looking at the city as a potential partner instead of maybe an obstacle to sort of get around. I think that would be well worth the time and a couple cups of coffee. I want us to embrace the idea of temporary. And in my talk, you might remember I talked about Times Square. When Mayor Bloomberg first proposed, turning Times Square into a pedestrian-only zone, there was a lot of blowback about that. People were scared. They were saying, you're going to bring traffic in Manhattan to a standstill, and the business owners there in Times Square were saying, you're going to kill our business. And the mayor said, well, hold on a second. We're going to do this on a temporary basis. If anything goes weird or sideways, we'll be able to change this pretty quickly. To alleviate, his community's fears. So when they did this, all they did was they painted some different directionals on the road. They brought in some very simple flower boxes like you'd get at Home Depot. And they brought in these really inexpensive lawn chairs just to see how people would use the space and to see if they liked it. And of course they loved it. And within a matter of months it became very clear that this was going to be a permanent solution. Now, I believe that Bloomberg had every intention that this was going to be permanent from the beginning. But in order to sell it to his community, he had to allow them to sort of come to it in their own time. He had to, allow them, say, look, it's going to be temporary. Okay, relax. And that deflected a lot of their initial fears about this project. So I'm sure there's all kinds of projects that, you guys would like to see happen here. And I think one of the great ways that you can, alleviate some of those fears and some of that blowback is, again, by doing something on a temporary basis. Which is why I suggested maybe a temporary dog park out here might be an interesting way to change the way, people are thinking about this stuff. And also, well, we're going to talk a little bit about, the importance, I think, of this area to your community as a whole. But embracing temporary is a fantastic way to do some of the things that you want to do to allow our citizens to maybe arrive at that space sort of in their own time. So temporary can definitely be your friend. And this goes back to this, the dog park idea is the psychic center of places. Most of the time, the psychic centers of places are downtowns. When you think of most cities, you think of your downtown. Well, in the absence of a traditional downtown, which you guys don't necessarily have, well, what is the sort of the default psychic center here? Well, it's here. It's the seat of power. It's where leadership happens. It is, we're sitting in it. And I think, kudos to you guys for, a few years ago, deciding that, when you were going to build a new city hall, you're going to make it a significant city hall, to well-designed and prominent, and maybe a city hall that fits the aspirations of where this community is going. At the time, because I understand that several years ago your city hall was much smaller and maybe more diffused over a couple of buildings, and you could have done sort of an incremental next step around that, but instead I think you went big, and I think this will pay off for you, because it says it's sort of a bold declaration, and in the absence of a traditional downtown, this becomes the psychic center of your city. And I think what's kind of significant about this is this area, the green that you guys are going to be developing. This will be incredibly important to your city. And by the way, I don't know if you planned it or not, but the fact that, right behind me as I'm taking this is your public library, and in front of us is the city hall. Well done. So you're bracketing, the green with those two sort of anchor institutions there. And obviously Kenmore camera right there next to it as well. Very good. And the residents, the new residential, this will be an incredibly important spot. And this could very well be the new psychic center. And again, it doesn't have to be a traditional downtown. And the example I use here is actually from Suwanee, Georgia. The Suwanee River is not in Suwanee, Georgia, which it's actually in Tennessee, which is kind of interesting. But so Suwanee, Georgia is about a half hour northeast of Atlanta. And this is their city hall. And as a city, they're about 21,000 folks there. And they built this enormous city hall because they are on a similar sort of very upward growth pattern with you guys. And locally they call this the City Hall of Justice because it looks an awful lot like the Justice League headquarters there, which I think is actually kind of fun. I'm a big comic book geek as well. But what they did here is they made the town sort of the town center here. On both sides it's got commercial space, so there's all kinds of restaurants and local shops there. Behind it there are there's homes, a lot of townhomes, a lot of single-family homes there. And in front is this massive community green space that gets used a whole heck of a lot. From standing here, if you look to your right, you would see this sort of a band shell, and they have this sort of tiered thing there in front of it. And they said they would have events. They've had concerts where up to like 14,000 people had attended that. But it's this highly active, highly programmed space. And I was there like on a Tuesday night. And on Tuesday night, there was actually what's called, you guys know the game Cornhole? It's played on college campuses. It involves bean bags, these things that you throw, these holes, and of course a beer there. And actually, the Cornhole League, they had like 24 cornhole games going on there after work, and folks were allowed to drink. You can buy a beer in the local restaurants there, and you walk across the little thing there, and you're in the park, and they figured out a way to make that happen. So while there's people playing cornhole, there's a huge running group that's meeting there. every Tuesday, and so they meet there and they run their thing. They come back to the restaurants. There's a running shop there. There's people, with their kids, and there are people walking their dogs. I mean, it's just this incredibly vibrant space, and it's nothing more than essentially a giant green space. So I think what you guys are going to do here with the green, this will be the sort of the front lawn for your entire community. And I think that one of the things that, then how do we start maximizing sort of, the experience and the utility around that? And I think the fact that you guys are going to do a splash pad, I think that's great. Kids love the splash pads. Parents will love that because the kids love it. You're doing the sort of living room sort of pavilion with retail, sort of mixed use. With a fireplace inside, and I saw Rob had showed me the designs with that. I think that's awesome. That people love fire, and that whole fireplace idea, sitting there comfortable, kids playing. There's something interesting going on over here. There's a coffee shop. There's restaurants around, and I think that there's a dog park here as well. That you figured out a way to integrate all of these little elements, all of these things that would bring people down here and say, this is good stuff. So I think, good on you. I think this is going to be even more impactful than maybe you guys, I think, fully realize. Because, in a place that, obviously you guys are, again, on a great, sort of growth path. But in the absence of sort of that traditional psychic center, all of a sudden now you're going to give people something new and different to absolutely latch onto. And I suspect that they will absolutely love this. So something to very much look forward to. A few other things. In my book, obviously, I talk about the love notes, which are the positive things, these small things with outsized positive impacts. But at the same time, there's also what I call daggers, which I think are the inverse of that. They're these small things that have an outsized negative impact. They're sort of the paper cut equivalent there. It's like a paper cut is not life-threatening, but man, at that point, it just hurts like hell, doesn't it? So these daggers are these small things, and they're things like, got to have the dagger, but they're things like this. We think about billboards. And I haven't seen too many billboards here, so well done in that area. But billboards are one of those things. It's like when one billboard goes in, we think, oh, well, okay, it's one billboard. But it's never just one billboard, because billboards have this ugly habit of sort of metastasizing, and one becomes two, and then the guy who owned the first one says, well, I'm getting half the eyeballs of the billboard, now that there's a second billboard in there, so I need another billboard. And again, so then you get into this sort of nuclear arms race of billboards, and you end up with this kind of visual clutter. This is sort of urban dandruff. It's certainly not pleasing. And again, this over time, this has an effect on people and the way they feel about places. There's that. I think Times Square in some ways is sort of positive sort of sensory overload. This to me is sort of a negative sort of sensory overload, because again, it doesn't seem to have much cohesion around that. So visual daggers like this. Or like this, power lines, visible power lines. Now, fortunately, I didn't, when I was looking for sort of an example of this, I did a search on, Google image search. This is nowhere in the United States, don't worry. This actually happens to be in Hanoi, in Vietnam. How'd you like to be the electric worker who had to fix that particular junction box? Yeah, I don't think so. But, nonetheless, when these utility lines sort of hang over our heads, they sort of hang over our heads like these dour set of drapes. And we don't necessarily think about it, but it does create this sort of oppressive feel, and it's ugly. And there is a cost to ugly that sometimes we are not necessarily thinking about as we go about this stuff, because it's more expensive certainly to bury your power lines, but there is a value to doing that, again, that goes beyond maybe potentially the initial cost of something like that. And then there are these things and these red light cameras, and I was actually talking with Mayor Baker about the red light cameras as well, and nobody likes these things, and if you ever are going to do them, one of the ways I had suggested this to the former mayor of St. Petersburg about this, if you ever do this, designate each camera for a very specific particular good. So if you said, okay, the light or the red light camera at this particular corner, all of those proceeds go to after-school programs for the kids. And then every quarter you do a report of how much money that that particular red light camera has generated for that particular cause. And people will never love these things, and I'm not a fan per se of these, but some cities in the last few years they embrace these because, again, as money got very tight, you're looking for new revenue. And there's a record, there's a mixed, bag of reports about whether or not these are actually improve safety or, they increase the number of actual accidents. I don't know. But if you ever do this, the only way I think to minimize the dagger effect, the negative effect of this, is to actually designate a very specific public good for each one of these cameras that are out there. So I don't know if that's something to consider, but it certainly is one of those opportunities there to minimize the negative. I want us to think about our high-touch entrepreneurs as well. And most of the time, cities will always say that they want to be more entrepreneurial, they want to be more business-friendly, and that's great. But most of the time when they're talking about these entrepreneurs, I get the sense that they're talking about the high-tech entrepreneurs, or they're talking about the high-volume entrepreneurs. Because it'd be great if we could bring in a business that would, employ hundreds, maybe even thousands of people. But I also think that it's important to remember the high-touch entrepreneurs, the ones whose businesses don't necessarily generate a lot of impact on traditional economic development scorecards, but they make our places better and more interesting, and they make our places feel like home. And a couple examples here. This is Jenny Britton Bauer there on the left. She makes ice cream. She's from Columbus, Ohio. And she started over 10 years ago in the farmers market there in Columbus on a weekend kind of basis. And she makes these really incredible artisanal ice creams. And people loved it. And she actually has opened up one shop there in Columbus, and one has become like 6 shops all around Columbus. She now sells her ice creams into all of the major supermarket chains there in the Midwest. And remarkably, when I was in Georgia and I visited Suwanee, and I also did a couple days in Decatur, Georgia, she had opened up there was a Jenny's ice cream that had opened up in Decatur, Georgia, there as well. To much fanfare, people loved the ice cream, and it's a great location. And it's one of those places, you go on a summer evening and there's a line out the door and people get their ice cream and they sit inside or they take it out into the park and they just stroll through their city. And you wouldn't think of that as being sort of, city building, but that absolutely is city building. And that's the kind of thing, those types of businesses, make a difference in the way we feel about our places. And this is my friend Phil Cooley. He's a restaurateur in Detroit. And Phil, it's going on almost 10 years ago now. Phil and a couple of his friends, they bought a building in the Corktown neighborhood in Detroit. And Corktown is the neighborhood where the old Tiger Stadium used to be. And they bought this building that didn't even have a roof at the time. And they bought it because Phil and his friends knew how to swing a hammer, so they were pretty confident that they could fix the place up. And they did, and they opened up a barbecue restaurant there called Slow's Barbecue. And it has become a huge success story. Not only is it a great restaurant, great barbecue there, but it was one of the first time that a new business really of any significance had opened up in the Corktown neighborhood there in Detroit. And it became this beacon for other entrepreneurs who said, well, wait a minute, there's life in Corktown. And all of a sudden now Phil became sort of this poster child for these young entrepreneurs who are coming back to the city of Detroit and starting these businesses that were making people feel differently about the communities. And he's had an incredible effect on revitalizing that part of town. And he's just this really humble guy. And you wouldn't think of a restaurateur or opening up a restaurant as being sort of community building or impactful, but sometimes where you do it absolutely makes a difference. So ice cream, Slow's barbecue, those kinds of business, a great coffee shop, your favorite local bookstore. These things matter, they above and beyond the pure economics of how they would score again on that economic development scorecard. I think we should maybe try some awesome. What do I mean by this? Well, the Awesome Foundation was founded about 5 years ago in Boston, and there was a group of young professionals who decided they wanted to put their money where their mouth was in terms of making their community a better, more interesting, more lovable place. And what they agreed was they would each donate $100 a month, and they would give out a $1,000 grant to a project that they thought was awesome. And they set it all up all online, and their application process was really simple. It says, tell us who you are, tell us what you want to do, and why it's awesome. Pretty simple. And people did. And the first project that they funded was actually a giant hammock that would seat like 24 people. Why? Because it's awesome. Now think about that. That's the kind of project that, if you went to the arts community, the Arts Council for funding, say, hey, what do you want to do? Say, well, I want to make this hammock. It'll seat like 24 people. It's like, the Arts Council would say, well, where's the artistic content in that? So, well, we'll make it pretty. Sorry, not appropriate. Okay, you go to the other side of that. You go to the United Way or the Community Foundation or something like that. So, well, what do you want to do? Well, I want to make this like giant hammock. It'll seat like 24 people. People would say, well, where's the social good in that? So, well, they'll hang out together. Hopefully they'll like each other. It'll be nice. It's like, oh, I'm sorry, not appropriate. So this is the kind of project that would absolutely not have a home in any sort of traditional funding mechanism that happens to be out there. Yet when you see these types of projects, you go, that's so cool. I'm glad somebody's doing this kind of stuff, and sort of incentivizing people to actually go out and maybe make some of these weird, wacky, and wonderful ideas happen. So in the sense of trying some awesome, it's like you could go out and start an awesome foundation, and maybe that might be a good thing. There's over 60 of them worldwide. Or you could just recognize that, getting a little bit of money in the hands of creative people to do some really different kinds of stuff could have some really interesting impacts, because they're going to do some stuff that, again, is completely off book and very, very different than the solutions we might ordinarily come up with. And again, it might turn out to be really, really awesome. So something to consider there. I want us to be better storytellers. And what do I mean by that? Well, this was hammered home to me by my friend Greg Burris, who's the city manager of Springfield, Missouri. And Greg said early on in his tenure as a city manager, he was having one of those meetings with all of his department heads, like Rob would have, I'm sure, on a weekly basis, where, we're sort of all checking in. And he said that the folks there in Springfield, the public works guys, which handle the sewers there in Springfield, they were relating something that had happened that week. And this woman had called Public Works in a panic. And she called up and said, my elderly mother who lives with us, she has dementia. And we think she's thrown her wedding rings down the toilet. Is there anything you guys can do to help us? And the public works guy said, well, give us your address, tell us where you live. And they looked into it and they said, okay, well, they live here. And what they ended up doing is they actually sent a robot into the sewer system. They went to this particular catch basin, they pulled up all that stuff, they went through it, and boom, they found the rings. Family is, of course, ecstatic. And the public works guys were like, well, you're very welcome. And Greg said at that point, he about jumped across the table. He said, why didn't you guys tell us this? And the public works guys were like, what? This is what we do. It's not about taking a bow. And Greg said, no, it's not about taking bows, but it is about telling our story. Now think about it. Cities, you guys get stuff right the vast majority of the time. 99.99% of the time, you get it right. Sometimes you get it extraordinarily right, like when you find this woman's rings in the sewer system. It's that 0.001% of the time when things go a little sideways. That's when the newspaper reporter shows up. That's when the local TV truck shows up on the front lawn there as well. And that's the story that gets printed. And that's the story that people hear. And they read it and they go, well, there's the city screwing up again. No, and that's actually not the case at all. That is the outlier. The vast majority of the time, you guys get it right. And what Greg realized is that no one was going to be telling that story, so he said, look, we have to be the ones to tell our story. And I thought that was really, he was trying to empower his folks, and that was a really important lesson about the importance of good stories. We generate more data about our cities than ever before. There's tons and tons of data. But data and information per se, that's not a good story. And we don't remember the data, but we do remember good stories. So I challenge us, I says, think about who are the best storytellers in our communities, and how do we, and in our, within government, within our departments and things like that, and how do we work with those folks, and how do we maybe increase that as a skill set? I'm sure all of you have gone through some sort of leadership training, and we think about that, and that's good, but we're not necessarily, by becoming, better leaders, we're not necessarily going to become, generals or the Fortune 500 CEOs or presidents or things like that. But we can all become better at leadership skills. Well, at the same time, I think we can all become better in terms of our storytelling skills as well. Because stories have, there is an art to storytelling. Stories have an arc. They have a narrative. They have heroes. They have villains. They have challenges that are overcome. They have resolutions. Those are the kinds of things that people respond to. So think about how we might be better storytellers. Because I'm sure every day we're generating some good stories about stuff that's happening here, in Kenmore. And instead of maybe telling a better story, we're trying to craft a more, a more artful press release. And, press releases aren't stories. So there is a difference in there. So I'd encourage us to embrace this idea and think about our storytelling capabilities and how we might improve that, because that ultimately is what is memorable. Remember, because good stories have legs. Good stories have a way of getting out there. So if we, craft a better story, it will find its audience out there as well. I want us to be aware of the cave people, the citizens against virtually everything. And I'm sure you guys know this, and I'm sure every week or so you guys have your council meetings, and the cave people get to show up and they get their 2 or 3 minutes of public time, and for that 2 or 3 minutes they get to stand up there and beat the hell out of you guys, tell you all the things that you've done wrong in the city, and you basically you sit up there and you have to take it, and it's like 3, 2, 1. Thank you very much, Mr. Kageyama. We'll take that under advisement. And, and that's fine. I mean, that is part of the democratic process. But here's the thing about the cave people is you're not going to change their minds. The cave people, in their own way, I do believe the cave people do love their cities. But it's sort of this twisted, sort of dark love affair, sort of like Gollum and the Ring, sort of my precious kind of thing. And I think at heart they believe they're protecting something. But most of the time they're trying to protect something to death there. And the thing about the cave people is you could acquiesce to all of their demands. You could agree with them 100%. You could make all the changes that they would like you to make, and they would still find something else to complain about. Why? Because it is in their nature. So in all of this, this continuum of engagement that I wrote about in my first book, it's like the vast majority of folks are actually sort of in the middle. The cave people, I think, are sort of out here. The ones who are the people who complain and they're angry, they're hostile, they're feeling about something, and they seem to get an awful lot of your time and attention. But if time and resources are finite, and of course they are, who would you rather spend time with? Well, I'd rather spend time with those folks, those co-creators that I was talking about, the ones who are actually out there making some interesting things happen. I'd rather work with these people over here on these people in the middle. Because those folks in the middle, they're the ones whose minds are still open and whose minds can still be changed. That is the battleground for you. So instead of spending all of this time and energy, again, on the cave people whose minds you're not going to change, I think the hardest thing in the world to do, and I fully understand this, but you got to ignore them. Because again, you are not going to change their minds. Who do you want to work with? I want to work with these people. And who's ultimately are we trying to convince? It's these people here. That's your audience. That is the folks. That is the vast majority of your constituents. And that's where time and energy and effort need to be concentrated there as well. And I do have a way that we might actually start facilitating this. I want us to try a good news only meeting. So you guys do 3 council meetings a month. So that's roughly 36 council meetings a year. Okay. One time out of the year, one meeting out of the year, I want us to designate that as the good news only meeting. So you set the agenda, and for that particular meeting, you can only, if you sign up for public input, you can only come up and tell something that, some way that we've positively impacted your life. Maybe you get the woman whose family, who you found her rings in the sewer, you get her to come up and tell that story, and a few other folks, because I think it's important for folks to hear the vast majority of those success stories. Because you say, look, we think it's important for our staff to hear this. We think it'd be good for council to hear this. We'd love to invite the local media as well, and I think we should invite the cave people to hear this as well. But you remind the cave people, says, look, Mr. Smith, if you want to come tonight and say something, you got to say something nice about us. At that point, Mr. Smith's head will explode. But the whole point of this is to sort of start changing the dialogue around, the way we think about our cities. And once a year, I think this is absolutely, not only doable, I think it's almost a necessity. I think it is, in some ways, it is an antidote to all of the other, the toxic comments that typically come out in these types of meetings. And I'm sure, you guys, again, I have the utmost, empathy for you guys, because again, you basically have to kind of take it there. And, you can engage in dialogue, but, I'm sure at some level you want to respond in a in a different way, but you totally can't do that. So I think once a year a good news only meeting would be a fantastic way to maybe start changing the way people perceive the hard work that you guys do. And remember, I said, wouldn't it be nice if some folks actually thanked us for the work that we actually do in the city? Well, this might be an opportunity for them to actually get up and say that as well. So I think that would certainly be a laudable thing to do. And last, I think I'd like us to embrace the idea of our civic experiments. What do I mean by that? Well, remember when we were like in junior high and high school and we were, like science experiments? Those were actually a lot of fun. And part of the fun of it is you kind of didn't know what was going to happen. It could go very sideways there. And we were cool with that at the time, that we weren't so afraid to fail in those kinds of experiments. Well, as we've gotten older, we've gotten very allergic to the idea of failure. And I know as public officials, it's very hard to embrace this idea of failure, because again, as soon as something fails on your watch, and then somebody's going to run that against you the next time you're up for election. Well, on your particular term, this particular project failed. You see it all the time. Well, that's because we've become allergic to the idea of failure, because we've lumped all failure into one big bucket. But all failure is not created equal. There is competent failure and there's incompetent failure. Competent failure says, you know what, we did our homework, we prepared, and for whatever reason, the rocket didn't launch. Incompetent failure says, you know what, we didn't prepare, we half-assed it, we didn't do our homework, we're going to get the F, and we'd probably deserve to get fired. And again, very different kinds of things, but again, we've lumped it all into one big bucket. And consequently, cities have become very, risk-averse, and they're comfortable with sort of incremental improvements, sort of, little steps, But I mean, that is not to minimize the importance of incremental improvement, but every now and then, I think we need to swing for the fences, in a calculated way, certainly. But I want us to have a 1 + 1 = 3 moment, or even better, a 1 + 1 = 10 moment. And what I'm really looking for is I want us to have our Diet Coke and Mentos moment. Now, you guys have seen the Diet Coke and Mentos experiments? Those crazy, ones that were very popular a few years ago. But you take these two very innocuous sort of things, you bring them together, and they have this amazing catalytic effect. And that's what I'm looking for in our communities. I want us to maybe bring two groups of people together that we wouldn't necessarily think about bringing together, and we put them together in the same room, and all of a sudden they make magic, and amazing things happen because of that. And that 1 + 1 = 3 moment then becomes 1 + 1 = 10, because other people build upon that stuff. But think about how many times somebody had to try some of this stuff before it actually worked. I mean, how many times did you have to drop, a Lifesaver into a Pepsi or a Tic Tac into a Fresca until you realize that, it's Diet Coke and Mentos. And then you have this amazing, eureka moment that other people then build upon. And the thing is you will never have your Diet Coke and Mentos moment if you are afraid to fail. Because the first time you try this, it's not going to work. And then you go, well, that didn't work. And then we just move on. No, we've got to build upon these kinds of things. Say, well, why didn't that work? Or I've seen other people do this. It's like, all right, well, let's try something, a little bit different. Oh, that's the magic formula. It's not, it's not this, it's that. And then you might actually have your huzzah moment. And that's really what we're looking for, this 1 + 1 = 10 kind of moment. And again, you will not have your Diet Coke and Mentos moment if you are afraid to fail. And this guy was pretty smart. He said, a person who never made a mistake never tried anything new. So let's not be that community that is so afraid to make a mistake that we never try anything new. There. And you hear all the time, people, they want to talk about they'd love to see government be more like business. I'm sure you hear this, you hear it everywhere. Well, one of the things that the business community absolutely knows and understands on a very fundamental level is the importance of failure. Talk to any successful business person. They're going to say, oh yeah, I did this and it failed, I did this, it failed, I did this, it failed, and I went broke, then I did this, and now I'm a success. What they did is they built upon competent failure. They learned from those mistakes. And they couldn't have got to the place that they ultimately are at without having gone through those mistakes. So I think if we are going to, embrace the idea of government being a little bit more like business, let us be more like business in that sense, where we have the opportunity to try something new, to swing for the fences occasionally, to take that calculated risk. And I think that we as citizens need to have your backs. When you go out and you try something and maybe it fails, it's like, well, was it a competent failure? It says, yeah. What did we learn from that? Well, we learned this and this. Are we going to get better next time? Yeah, and I think we'll get it next time. Okay, I'm in. I will stand behind our leaders who competently fail, who try these civic experiments, and maybe they don't go the way that we would hope. And I believe at heart our citizens understand that, because I think they understand the value of those types of endeavors and those attempts. So let's not maybe shy away from that, because I think if we, we should stand by our records of experiments. It's like, what did we try? What did we learn from that? How did we get better? And where does that ultimately lead us? And I think it leads us into some really interesting possibilities. Again, incremental improvement is great, and we should be focused on that, but occasionally, I want that Diet Coke and Mentos moment. And again, part of that is, again, not being afraid to fail and standing by our record of civic experiments. Some cities have to, sort of embrace these civic experiments. Cities like Detroit, I think, are incredible laboratories right now for civic experimentation because they have to. Things are obviously, pretty good here in Kenmore. Very good here. Again, you guys are on a very interesting sort of growth path and trajectory. That doesn't mean we should be content with just sort of, I think, in the midst of all of that, I think it actually shows a lot of character to say, you know what, I'm not just content with the great sort of path we're on here. I think we can do even better. And the only way to maybe do even better is, again, to try maybe, again, something a little bit different and something a little bit, maybe even a little bit risky. And I think our citizens probably will have our backs on that when they understand sort of, okay, what we're trying and why we did it on a very fundamental level. So that's about all I had to officially to tell you guys here tonight, but I'd be very happy to maybe answer some questions, have a little chat about this stuff. Questions, comments, any of that? Yes. Oh,
go ahead.
Well, there's so much there. Where do you start? I mean, as you're going through it, I'm thinking of things where we have kind of, taken some risk. I think in a way our business incubator was that way because we really didn't know where that was all going to go. And, I think in a lot of ways it's been very helpful in terms of having something to talk about and that kind of thing. One thing that would help me a little bit is to hear some of your first responses. I know you've seen a little bit of the city, and you've already thought about the temporary dog park out in City Hall. I'm kind of thinking maybe sprinkler for the summer at least, for the kids, right? Yeah. We wanted a water feature, but, maybe it'll be our garden hose, but anyway. But just maybe some of your other thoughts and impressions. I mean, obviously, I know the community's going to have a lot to talk. You have the advantage of fresh eyes. We see it all the time, and after a while you don't see it. And so it's always fun to have someone come in.
Do I need to hit this again? No, okay, it all comes back to me. Okay. Yeah, fresh eyes, that's a good way to put it. Yeah, I like to say I can be the critical friend. I can say, some stuff says, those shoes don't go with that belt kind of thing. Or I can say, you know what, that's a great looking outfit. That's like this old thing. It's like, yeah, this old thing. I'm terribly impressed with again, this part, here. And again, I think that will be very significant, for you guys. What else the incubator, I thought the fact that there's maybe a microbrewery going in the bottom of the incubator, I think that's pretty cool. And I know that the tech guys who are maybe in the incubator above, they're going to love it. And you think, well, is that a good mix? I think, yeah, that's a pretty darn good mix there as well.
When I took you to the St. Edward Seminary today, what was that idea you had?
Oh, yeah, the seminary. So, I guess there's some talks with different kinds of developers there who might want to do. There was some mention of like a hotel or a conference meeting space, which I think sounds great, and it's a beautiful building. But what about sort of like one of those? Maybe it's because I spent the time there at the university there, but. Get some of the Bastille sort of energy and do sort of a holistic spa. So in addition to the hotel and the meeting center, it's like, well, could we come here and have some aromatherapy? Could we have some nutritionists? Could we have some of this kind of stuff? And give the Bastille, students a place where they could actually, do some work, the practicum side of things. And people, they like this kind of stuff. That's, again, that holistic approach, to medicine and wellness. And talk about a great location there in the middle of a park. It's like, wow, I can get I can get a facial and my nails done. I can get my hair and and then have again aromatherapy and some of this other kind of stuff that this a nutritionist there. That's a pretty cool thing. So maybe you integrate some of that kind of stuff because that just seemed like the natural fit, there again with Bastille right there, and Dr. Church had even said that the opportunities for his students to get the practical their what did he call it? The something like the hands-on training that they need to do. They'd have to go pretty far and wide to find those kinds of opportunities. Well, right there would be kind of an interesting one as well.
And then another impression you had of it was maybe in the meantime it would...
it'd be a great haunted house. Yeah.
About the St. Edward Seminary building?
Yeah.
They actually have done a number of movies there. And they use it, those old rooms and stuff were the haunted things. And years ago, I took a field trip of 7th graders, and once they heard those stories about the haunted house, they were all ducking in and out all these rooms and scaring each other. So, yeah, I think it's got some history there.
Yeah, and I mean, the story. That's part of what makes it so interesting. There, and oftentimes, I love, the fact, I'm a big fan of historic preservation, but I'm not necessarily a fan of saving something that's old simply because it's old. That, it has to be old, it has to have, good bones and a good story. And that's why we save old buildings, not simply because it's like, well, it's old and we should save it. No. But that clearly has got good bones and a great story. So yeah, could be some very interesting things that could be done with that. And the Kenmore Air guys, I think that's a really interesting group. And the fact that you're the largest seaplane operation in the United States. And I'm sure a lot of people know your city because of Kenmore Air. Oh yeah, okay. Yeah, and again, also
you
a
see
good
the little
story.
trailer that they have? It's not a trailer, it's like a little dock. It's an international port of customs.
Yes.
I just love that part that they have. We have our own little international point of entry.
Right. It's like a double wide point of entry kind of thing. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, and one thing that kind of, I don't know, occurred to me is because I took him to Kenmore Camera and had him meet with Jim Donovan, and while we were meeting with Jim, we were talking about all the partnerships we have between us and Kenmore Camera and all the great things they do for the community.
Oh, yeah.
And then same Bastille, we brainstormed all the cool things that they do for the community, whether it's the art show or the herb fair or the
Holiday concerts, yeah.
Yeah, the concerts in the chapel, and just the list goes on. And then it dawned on me, I'm like, we are already doing a lot of this already. These love notes are all over the place, right before our eyes.
Yeah, and really, sometimes, what I talk about, I think is fairly obvious stuff. This is not revelatory, but the fact is that sometimes we just sort of overlook this. We think, oh yeah, this is just sort of the stuff that we do. It's sort of that nice to have kind of stuff. And my fundamental point about the way I try to get people to think about their cities is that we are actually thinking a lot about our cities. We're very smart about our cities. We're very intelligent. And then there's all kinds of best practices around, running cities and how to get better in that sense. Where I think we have the real opportunity is to bring the emotional side into the equation as well, and to become very emotional about our places and recognize that we as human beings, in addition to being, we are cerebral, we are intelligent creatures, but we're also very emotional creatures, and we respond to things. And a lot of times when you can couple an emotional response with this intelligence that we obviously have, that's when people are firing on all cylinders. That's when you have this incredibly engaged people that are, not only you're getting their best thinking, but you're getting their best selves as well. And I often point out to folks that at heart because we are emotional creatures, we actually make a lot of decisions on an emotional level. We think we're doing it on this intellectual level, but most of the time what happens is, we make this decision emotionally, then we justify it intellectually. It's like, well, why'd you buy that car? It's like, well, it gets good gas mileage and it's very safe. And I look really cool in it as well, So there is, there is that sort of context that goes into it there. So let's recognize that we are emotional creatures and allow ourselves to do that. And I think that sometimes it's hard for cities to sort of embrace that because it feels kind of squishy by comparison to some of the hard stuff that you guys do. And again, there are those folks who want to hold your feet to the fire and say, why are we wasting time on that squishy stuff? Why are we bringing this guy who's talking about love? We should be talking about fixing the roads, fixing the schools, and we got these bridges that are falling down. Of course you do. But that can't be the totality of the experience that we have with our city, because if that's the case, that feels pretty bleak to me. So at heart, we recognize that there is a value to this emotional stuff, and allowing ourselves that space So maybe, if anything, I'm giving you guys permission to become more emotional about your cities. I'm talking to these folks here as well. That it's not just about our intellect in this process. That it has to engage us, at our hearts. And I think when we do that, we actually get some really amazing, results. And it could be small, funny, weird little stuff at the same time. And then it's occasionally some really big, important, significant stuff as well.
Yeah, and it's not about creating new programs and throwing a lot of city dollars and new positions and stuff. It's about helping our citizens understand that they have the freedom to take initiative.
Yeah.
And create
and
a lot of
that's
this.
at heart. That's what the workshop we're going to do tomorrow night is about. It's I'll do a sort of a version of my talk, and then we'll show lots of examples of these projects that have been citizen-led, small things where these citizens just do amazing things for their communities with very little bits of money. And that's what we're sort of hoping for. And we actually do have a little grant that we're going to give out, tomorrow. And we're going to challenge folks, if you had $500 to make Kenmore a better, more interesting, more lovable place, what would you do? And that's a very interesting question because, if we had said, look, we got a $5,000 grant, we got a $10,000 grant, that feels like real money. And that is real money to most people. But that would, we would start thinking at a certain level with that kind of money. In fact, we'd probably overthink it. We'd come up with an idea and then we'd say, hey, city, Rob, you and your team need to go do this. And then we've basically created more work for ourselves. At $500, we see ourselves as the people who are going to implement that particular thing. We're going to cook up this idea. We're going to take our $500. We're going to go down to Home Depot. We're going to buy the stuff. And this weekend, we're going to knock this thing out. Cool. So it sort of changes the idea of who makes the city. Most citizens sit back and they wait for you guys to make the city better for them. In return, hopefully, they pay their taxes, they spend their money locally, they obey the law. That's okay, and that's fine. But what we're trying to do is maybe encourage a little bit more of participation from folks. And the way you're going to do that is you can appeal to their sense of, civic duty. It's like, okay, I'll show up for the neighborhood cleanup, okay. But if you appealed to their sense of fun and their emotions, I think you're going to get a very even better response, from that. So that's kind of what we're trying to do, with that. Prime the pump a little bit to get people to think about what the small things that they might actually be able to do that makes the city better, more interesting, more lovable place. And sometimes it doesn't even involve necessarily your permission. I'm gonna put that out there. That there might be a rule or two that might be broken or bent in this process. And I think that part of leadership is knowing there's the letter of the law and the spirit of the law, right? And sometimes recognize, well, what are we trying to accomplish here? And let's keep that in mind as we go through this, because our citizens, if they're willing to step up and do something for us, that's a pretty precious thing. And I think we should try not to squelch that enthusiasm that folks have for doing something for their community.
Yeah, and we really tried to stress that today in the co-creator meeting. We
Yes.
had that at 3 o'clock today. And we called that meeting on relatively short notice, and we asked a bunch of citizens to come that volunteer their time and come up with cool ideas.
Did you share with us who was at that meeting?
Yeah. So again, it was 3 o'clock on a Monday. So we had about 8 people come. And one thing I wanted them to know is they're not alone. There's a larger pool of people just like them out there. But we had Sarah Hayashi, Stephanie Burrell, Nicole Suarez, Deborah Shrebnick, Nikki Delgado, who is an Inglemore High School student. She's a junior. Neil Jorgensen, Leroy Annenson, and Cindy Rustine. And they had some great ideas. They talked about what the things they're doing to help the community. For example, Cindy Rustine, she helps with Play Day and Kenmore events team. But another thing she's trying to get going is Radio Kenmore. Yeah.
Yes.
And she's trying to create, in her words, a production culture versus a consumer culture in Kenmore. In other words, getting people to contribute and help out and do things to make their community better.
People who make content. Content is everything from, an actual, building something. Content is people who write, people who produce, pieces of art, ideas. So all of us consume content, but not everybody makes content. So, so if she's trying to, a culture of production, that is a different mindset. So yeah, that's actually very exciting.
And they were thrilled to be there. They were so tickled that they got asked to come to this special meeting with people.
And again, that goes back to what I was saying, that if you ask folks to do something like that, they go, wow, the city's asking me. They think, they think what I'm doing must matter. And clearly it does. And, so that recognition, I mean, that's fuel for them. That could be, for a long time. That people will, if they do nothing else, it's like, hey, I'm flattered that my city actually thought enough of me to, to include me in this particular, conversation. There is value to that, so, and it cost us, you guys, some cookies and not even a cup of coffee. So there you go.
You haven't met with the Waterfront Activities Group yet.
Meeting tomorrow, yeah.
Okay. They're a bunch of co-creators as
Yeah.
well, and Deborah Srebnick is one of those who you met today.
Yeah.
The thoughts that I'm having on the town green, for example, we could just just plant lawn out there, and that would be a town green. But we've decided to really make this a special place.
I saw the plan,
and not just the special place, but special programming to follow up on that. And we'll be spending a lot of money on that. But this is an area where these co-creators can really have an impact in the programming of it. And we need to encourage that. I was one who was a little hesitant about spending that much money on it and blowing our whole kitty that we had from the sale of the property on this, but I think it's going to be worthwhile in the long run. Now, it's a major thing for this small city, and a lot of projects that the city gets involved in, you get public input as to what to do with it and so on. And I don't know whether there are any lessons that we might learn from the experiences of St. Petersburg in your peer as to, how much public input you want and how much initiative and risk-taking the city should take and so on. I don't know whether it applies at all here, but maybe.
The tricky thing about public input is you have to do it. But it comes back to, sort of what I mentioned about the temporary kind of stuff is a lot of times citizens can't, it's hard to imagine something they've never seen before or experienced before. So you ask them to say, well, we'd really like to do light rail. Okay. Well, if you've never lived anywhere where you have a light rail system, it's like, this is awesome. But if you think, well, trains, why'd I want to ride a train? It's like, I've got a car. It's like, so it's like, well, no, the solution is not trains. The solution is more highways and, and stuff like that. So again, that's just, so the public input you would get from that is like, well, we don't need more trains. We need more, more lanes on the highway. And we know that that's not a solution. That actually just ultimately actually increases traffic even more. So, so citizens, input, I think, is limited. I think the better questions to ask is, instead of saying, well, tell us what you want, because then they'll tell you the things that they're familiar with for the most part. Ask them, what do you want to feel? What would be sort of, what would be the impression that you'd like people to have when you have friends who come and visit Kenmore? What's the impression you'd like them to have? And then they might speak in some different language and use different verbs and adjectives around that. And you go, okay, they want to be proud of their city. They want they want to be able to entertain their folks. Okay, so they want they want good design. They want activities. They probably want restaurants and things like that. So I think asking some different types of questions, I think, is kind of is a good thing. And Alan is actually referencing the St. Petersburg Pier debacle, and it is a debacle in my hometown. In an otherwise really wonderful city and a really, really vibrant downtown, we have this municipal pier that was closed about a year and a half ago, and it had to be closed because the pilings are falling apart. And it's about a quarter-mile long, and it ends in this sort of, there's essentially an upside-down pyramid at the end of the pier, like 5 stories high. Used to have restaurants and shops, and the restaurants didn't get much, they certainly got very little local traffic, and it was a touristy thing. It was kind of a dump, really. It was not very impressive. Locals would not have been caught dead at the pier. It's sort of like the old Times Square. Local New Yorkers would not have been caught dead in Times Square. So the city went through this process where they did a public input thing, and they did it for almost 2 years. This was probably dating back 5 years at this point. And they ended up doing this open, RFP process, and they had people submit their, credentials and their plan for the pier, and it was down to like 8 or 10 groups at the thing, and then they whittled that down to 3, and then those 3 actually presented to a special committee that was there. And one particular design was chosen. It was called the Lens. It was this sort of helix-shaped kind of thing, very different, a walking pier only, and really it would have been quite lovely. Well, at that point, some citizens got involved, so we didn't have a chance for public input, which was completely not true. There was all kinds of public input. They just weren't paying attention to it until there was actually a manifest design. It's like somebody said, "I don't like it." And then at that point, there was a public, they got enough votes to get a public referendum, and we were essentially voting on a piece of public art. And most of the time, when does public art ever survive sort of like a populist sort of scrutiny around that? It's like, I don't get it. It's like, sometimes art is not for you to get. Sometimes art is for you to go, I don't get it, or I don't like it. That is a perfectly valid response to public art. And so this was one of those experiences where we had to pull it back, and they actually canceled the contract after about $3 or $4 million into the contract with this particular design group. And so the new mayor in fact, the prior mayor, I think, was probably not reelected, mostly because of the pier. So that was, I think, a missed opportunity there. So the new mayor comes in saying all the right things and says, okay, we're going to have more public input. We're going to do an online. We're basically going to do it better this time. And they really didn't do it any better. In fact, in some ways, they made it worse. The recent thing, they did this online vote. They said, we're going to do a non-binding vote. Well, when citizens hear vote, that's the only word they hear. Non-binding doesn't exist in that sort of framework. And really what they wanted to do is they ended up, there was 8 designs were there, and they asked for public input on that online. People, could vote on the one that they wanted. And they said, well, we'll take that under advisement, and this committee will then choose 3, and those 3 will ultimately, we'll sort of pitch, and there'll be a final vote. So the committee ends up picking like the top 2 vote getters and the 8th most popular vote getter. And it's like, it was they were all interesting. But there was this hue and cry. Says, why are you choosing number 8? We didn't like that. We voted against that. It's like, wait a minute. You didn't vote against it. We were looking at that as sort of public input. But the fact is that people heard vote, and they thought it was a determinative kind of thing. And here's the lesson that we can all learn from American Idol. American Idol does take the voting into account, but you never see the actual results of those votes, do you? No, it's like what they're doing is they want to take the temperature of people and the way they feel, and then they feed that to the judges and whatnot. So that's sort of playing. It's like, Alan is polling really well in the Midwest, but he's not scoring very well in sort of our major markets and whatnot. So maybe so they'll tell him that kind of stuff, and that sort of factors into the whole thing. And that was kind of how they probably should have handled the public input. You don't make the voting results public because, again, people hear vote and they think that's the deal. So it was this huge, it remains a huge debacle. And I actually have to go, I've been asked to come and speak to the public hearing in a couple weeks, and I'm kind of like, what am I going to say to these folks? Because really, all I'm going to say is, I like blue versus red versus yellow. And what does that matter at this point? Because ultimately what it is, it's now a question of taste. I don't know. It's not something I've tried not to weigh in too much on, but I'm very disappointed in our city the way we've kind of handled that. So in the future, when you do public input, yes, you want to have it, but make it so that allows you guys the latitude to make the hard decisions that sometimes need to be made. Leadership sometimes means taking the shots. People are going to say, why the hell did we do that? It's like, that's ugly. It's like, no, give it a little time. I'm sure when people were, when you suggested this building, I'm sure a lot of people were, kind of up in arms about this. What are you talking about, this city hall? We don't need all this. It's like, I don't like it. And again, that's part of leadership, is taking those shots, right? That's right. So public input is important, but I think asking different questions when we do that, try to really tease out the way people want to feel about places, that I think is more interesting, and then sort of the process itself could maybe be a little bit smarter. But I do invite you all to come and visit St. Petersburg. It is a lovely city, and hopefully in the next couple of years we actually do have something at the end of that pier. Because right now it's basically you can walk out there, but you can't go in it. You can still fish off of it. but it's sort of our ruin in waiting kind of thing. And sorry, it's a bit of a mess. Probably a longer explanation than you'd like, but I think there is an interesting lesson to be learned there for cities.
Sure.
Steve.
Tomorrow, are you going to be asking the citizens about what they think our daggers are, or are we keeping it?
No, I'm very much. When I do the workshops, I keep it very positive. I sort of remind us as leaders that that's something that we need to be thinking about. No, when one of the things I think that is really good about the workshops that I do is we keep it incredibly positive. There's really no room for people to stand on their soapbox and grind on their issue, because again, we're trying to keep it very positive.
To see how
we've learned that lesson. I used to do this. We've been refining this for about 4 years now, and it definitely seems to work. It puts people into the right frame of mind, the right sort of spirit. And again, this is the kind of public meeting that you guys absolutely want to come to, because people will leave in a very good mood. There will be smiles, there will be laughter. They will absolutely be loving Kenmore, and by extension, you guys as well. So there will be no complaining allowed at this particular meeting.
Can you go through a real brief outline of what you hope to accomplish?
Well, I think the ultimate thing I want to accomplish, again, is empowering citizens to believe that these small things really do make a difference, and recognizing that a very little bit of money can actually do quite a bit of good. And even if their project doesn't get funded, hopefully they might say, I really want to do this. Let's go make this happen. And ultimately, that's what we'd like to see, is not really just one project that we're going to give a grant to, but a whole slew of projects that people feel enough interest. It's like, hey, that's really cool. We should do that. Or maybe some stuff that maybe the city says, that project didn't win, but I like that, and maybe we might know some people. We might be able to help, facilitate actually making some of that kind of stuff happen. We're gonna talk about sort of your identity and who you guys are and what you guys, how you guys think about yourselves. It's sort of reflective, but it's all again trying to get us to this point where we can actually think really sort of creatively and and again out of the box. From what we typically think about as city building.
Yeah. And at the last council meeting, did I talk about the $500 grant?
Yeah.
Did I? I can't remember if I did or not. Yeah. Well, it's now 500. I've been reluctant to announce it out to the public because we didn't get the money up until today.
Like this afternoon, actually.
Yeah. This afternoon. We had 400 as of Friday, I think, and then another
pass the hat.
Pass the hat came in today. But so can you talk a little bit about that and how that's going to work? And by the way, this is all private donations, so it's not city dollars.
Well, the way it's happened in the past is that usually when somebody comes and you give a grant, it's like, all right, here's the application process. I need your your social security number. I need your EIN. I need all of this kind of stuff. Like, no, none of that. In fact, it's been funny how some places have handled the actual disposition of the funds. So most of the time, it's like, well, okay, tell us the winning team, like designate a leader. We'll figure out a way to get you guys a check, and you guys go and do it. That's about all the oversight that is actually involved. And so far, nobody has taken the money and run kind of thing. Because they are essentially sort of standing up in front of their fellow citizens and they're sort of saying, hey, we think this is a good idea. And we as the citizens in the room, we voted on it, and now all of a sudden it's like, whoa, now I got to do it. Yeah, you kind of do. You sort of put yourself out there as well.
And you took the money.
Well, and they said they'd take the money. In Anchorage, Alaska is a different kind of place. Anchorage, Alaska, the head of their Economic Development Corporation, they actually gave out 2 grants, and he showed up with like 2 bags of $500 in brown paper bags. Seriously, it's like, oh, we're going to give this out. It's like, okay, cool.
That's what we're going to do.
Why not? Yeah. And so, I know that it's a little challenging, and I think it's good that you were able to raise the private money, for that. I get that, city just can't like throw away, things like, here's $500, go do something, funny and weird and wacky. No, but we're not going to make it very difficult there. And I think, again, people have more sense than I think we give them credit for. Like I said, no one's taking the money and run.
Yeah, and the room will be set up with tables, and so people will be grouped together in small clusters.
Yeah, like 5 or 6 at a table is sort of idea.
And then will each table come up with a proposal?
Yes. So each group will get like, they'll do like one proposal. Let's say if we have 50 people, there'll be, let's say 10 teams of 5 each. So there'll be 10 different projects that are pitched. And then at the, everyone will pitch, and then, everybody will get a chance to, a little Post-it note vote. Everybody votes, winner gets the pot. Pretty simple.
Milton. So we've been talking recently about being a walkable city.
Jeff Speck was here, I understand.
And
or you've read Jeff Speck.
Yes.
Yeah.
And
He's
we
a
have
friend of
ways
mine.
to go.
Yeah.
But we sort of see 182nd.
Yeah.
Between 65th and 73rd as probably our walkable area.
Yeah.
And most of it's private land. Mm-hmm. And so since reading that book, I've had a different view. I say, every lot is really important. And if something really ugly and really solid and non-friendly goes in there, it limits, because we only have 8 blocks.
Yeah.
This will be our walkable city. Mm-hmm. Any thoughts on how you balance that? We want something really good to happen with, yep, we don't own it.
Lead by example. Make it, make your stuff really good, and other people will feel sort of compelled to follow. That say, you don't have to, initiate design standards or design guidelines. I mean, it might be nice, but I think, you make it clear that, to developers, look, this is our expectation. This is our downtown. And if you're going to come here, and we want you, and obviously, we want to have you participate, but you've got to make it work, in what we're trying to accomplish here. So make sure that the people who follow you guys, that they buy into that vision, that this is going to have to be the walkable portion of our city. And even though it's only 8 blocks, by the way, I heard this from a downtown retail specialist a couple of years ago. I thought this was kind of interesting. He said the secret formula for a successful, a vibrant downtown is 3 contiguous blocks. They have to have 20 shops and a total of 20 shops and 20 restaurants on those 3 blocks, and the majority of which have to be open beyond 6 o'clock, because you can create a vibrant downtown with that formula. 20 restaurants and shops, 3 blocks, most of them open after 6, and you have to be able to walk it, obviously. So I think the best way for you guys, again, is to lead by example and make your stuff really walkable, really permeable and friendly and people-centered, and then I think other folks will feel sort of compelled to follow.
We do have some empty lots and some that are clearly at a time in their life that they're ready for restoration.
Yeah.
Do you do anything to actually reach out to the owners or people to say, let's get involved, and can we kind of get excited with you?
Hopefully you have, relationships with some of those property owners. I mean, there's always those recalcitrant ones who are just basically sitting on it, waiting for, somebody to offer them an outrageous amount of money for it. I think work around and say, look, we can't do this, and it's sitting empty and it's kind of ugly. Could we do something temporary on it? And maybe work with them in that sense. Again, it goes back to that idea of temporary. I think is a great sort of antidote to that. I wrote about this in the new book. There was an interesting example in Pensacola, Florida. As downtown, it was on the corner of 2 fairly significant downtown streets, and it was this weird little shaped lot. It was maybe 25 feet wide and a good 150 feet deep. So it was kind of a strange little thing. It's like, what could you put on this? And the city kind of recognized that, but it was sitting at a very visible spot. So maybe one of these visible spots might sort of follow this idea. The city actually said what they did is they put in some infrastructure, some seating, some restroom facilities, and some electrical, some power stuff in there. And they brought in 4 Airstream trailers, and they set up what was essentially sort of a semi-permanent food court with food trucks there, with the whole idea that people love food. They'd have 4 new restaurants there in downtown. People would have a place to sit and congregate. And if along came a developer who was interested in developing that particular piece of land, said it would be nothing to move 4 Airstream trailers. And it was a minimal investment in infrastructure to support something like that. It was a great long-term temporary solution to something like that. So maybe there's something that you could do with some of these pieces of properties, with some of these folks. Look, we can't, we're not going to buy it, but we recognize that, in the meantime, let's get some use out of it. And maybe by getting some use out of it, people might actually say, this is an interesting space. I could do something here. Instead of it just sits empty and moribund, you've got to have a heck of a lot more imagination to see some possibilities in that. But if you're in it and you're using it, all of a sudden now, okay, yeah, this could work. So maybe some of those long-term temporary kinds of solutions might be applicable to some of those empty lots, or at the very least do something fun and creative in them. Turn your arts folks loose in them, for a month. Do creative installations in places like that. Oh, and by the way, for your when you actually do ultimately sort of break ground to tear down the stuff, the parking lot over there, and what do you call it right now? The
Kenmore Village, but when we do the tear down of the buildings, is that...
Well, Kenmore Village. So when that begins, it's finally closed and all that stuff, is you guys should do a Viking funeral for Kenmore Village. And think about sort of send it out with a bang. Do something weird and crazy that normally you couldn't do because we got to use this space. Well, what could you do if you knew you were going to tear it down next week? It's like, okay, you could actually do something really kind of fun. And it's not really big enough to do like an implosion like you would do in Vegas with like an old hotel, but you could maybe do like a really interesting sort of bonfire or something like that out there in the thing. I know the fire marshal's going to hate me because I'm talking about all this fire related stuff, but but nonetheless. So I mean, think about
Practice on something.
They got to practice on something. Yeah, it's like, hey, standing by. Now think about it. If you if you do that, you're sort of sending this thing out with a bang. It's like, okay, we're closing this chapter in our city, which is great. But at the same time, you're also sort of saying, we're creating this sort of different experience in this space. And what you're actually doing is saying, what's coming is actually not going to be more of the same old. We're closing one chapter with a very interesting thing, and we're sort of opening up the expectation of what this space might actually be in the future. And it might actually be the kind of place where we come together and we did this crazy thing. We had this bonfire and we did something really weird, and there was this art performance, and there was a drum circle, and there was fireworks, and there was dogs, and I don't know, but it seems like the kind of thing that would actually sort of usher in the next version of this thing in a really interesting way. So a Viking funeral, I think, needs to be had in those spaces.
Thank you.
Anybody else?
We could have the Inglemore High School band come and play some melancholy song or something as the excavator takes the first bite out of the building.
Nothing melancholy. Have them play something from
Fight song.
Yeah,
big fight song.
The theme from Rocky, or or something from AC/DC or something like that sort of shakes the timbers there.
Drum band.
I
Do a lot with a stick of dynamite.
Yes, you could.
Hey, Peter, I have a question for you. On recreation and cheap ways of adding recreational components, you talked a lot about the emotional connections and people having fun, and a lot of it that, for me, is when I see people being active in doing, it could be the simplest, it could be like a bocce ball or whatever it is, competition, or a volleyball court and different things. I'm just wondering if you have any specific examples or any ideas that you've seen implemented in areas that really added a whole new dimension to a particular space.
You mentioned bocce, and I've seen some really interesting sort of examples, of that. Really simple. I mean, it's the balls and stuff like that. The cornhole thing, easy to set up, easy to tear down. You see some of those things like those giant, chess or checker sets, which are kind of clever. I think that's, there's some fun to that. But I think, maybe the better thing would be, some seating that has sort of the built-in chessboards that maybe invites those people who actually do really play chess, that they might actually want to come down and sort of sit and have that kind of experience. Those little touches that are maybe a bit more, specific to, how folks might actually want to play a game or something like that. Your bike share sort of programs. And, you see that, I saw that in Seattle, and maybe at some point there's a bike share program that integrates with their system, which would be kind of interesting. But in the meantime, and I think Rob had mentioned this, is some really creative, bike racks. Just the kind of thing that says bikes are welcome here. And you have a place to park it and lock it up and go into the coffee shop or the restaurant or see a show or something, or walk into an art gallery like that. Those little touches, You don't have to start out with really big stadiums and all kinds of other stuff, but the little things that might make it a little bit easier. Could we do something? We're talking about all of these sports, these kayaks and the paddle boards and stuff like that. And I know that trying to unindustrialize parts of your waterfront is kind of a challenge. But of course, there's going to be people who want to bring their boats in. But those stand-up paddle boards are incredibly popular in Florida right now. The personal kayaks are really popular. So maybe at some point you are able to do some waterfront, some places for boats. Well, maybe you carve off a small portion of that includes places for individuals to come in and put their personal kayak or their stand-up paddleboard and stuff like that. Again, those small touches that allow people to recreate and have that experience in their place, I think, actually go a very long way towards making people feel like, this is comfortable. This feels like home. So again, it doesn't have to be big and expensive, but maybe those little things of how people are already interacting with your environment. And I understand that your bike trails are incredibly popular, here. Are there places for folks to, get water? A little water stand, a place where you can fill up your water bottle easily instead of having to twist the knob and tilt your water bottle sideways and hopefully try to get it 3/4 of the way full or something like that. I don't know, those kinds of things. I saw one that was actually really very clever in Quad Cities there in Iowa and Illinois. They actually had this bike repair rack, and it was like this stand. It was about yay tall, and there was a thing that these different sets of tools that were attached by cords, like Allen wrenches and tire irons that you could actually go. You could change a tire. You could adjust your bike. There was a pump that you could actually pump up your bike tires with, and it was this free. It was this sort of like a parking, meter, but it was embedded. But it was it was like a portable bike shop right there for the bike riders, to use. I mean, that's the kind of thing that people say, oh, well, we could stop in Kenmore. Your tire's a little wobbly. You need to adjust your seat. Well, we're a mile away from Kenmore. Let's stop there. Little thing.
Yeah, we have an Eagle Scout that just installed one of those at St.
Really?
Edward State Park. Yeah.
There you go.
And we plan on doing one at the town green.
You mentioned the water. Last fall we were down at Zion National Park, and all around there on stone walls and stuff, there are these bronze spigots.
Yeah.
Not a hose thing, but not a drinking fountain, but a faucet. And you can fill your water bottle all over. A lot of hikers around there and so on.
It just makes it a little bit easier, and it recognizes that, people aren't coming here, they're not looking for a sip of water, they're looking to replenish their Camelback, their water bottle as they hike through here.
Right.
So,
Yeah.
Anything else? Milton?
Any other ideas on how to use the Burke-Gilman Trail and all the traffic that's coming through?
I don't know. Have you ever set up, like some sort of food or a Sunday brunch as people are riding through? Thank you for stopping by Kenmore. It's like here's a little sandwich, a little something. Here's some orange juice, something like that. That just might encourage them to stop. The hardcore cyclists, they're not going to stop. That's not what they do. But the recreational cyclists, the ones who are getting a little exercise, and it's like, the city. It's like, well, yeah. Usually we just ride through here. It's like, well, have some local fare. You hand out some, maybe talk to some people, and become known as that sort of a friendly city that that does this kind of stuff. And you might mention, and by the way, come back in about a year or so. We're going to have a pretty amazing, green just right over this hill. There'll be, it'll be bike friendly. It'll be, a lot of stuff to do. I don't know. Take advantage of the fact that these people are riding past here all the time. What could you do? Something to be kind of nice for them, or at the very least, some interesting sort of chalk art there that they roll over. Something that is visually memorable. For that. Welcome to Kenmore. Thanks for coming. Something like that. Like those Tour de France, things, signs you see on the road. People, chalk all that kind of stuff. If that was something that was done on a regular basis, those little things, it's like people remember that. So, again, not much money. Just thinking about the problem in a different way.
I'm letting everybody else have a chance, but I never seem to run out of questions.
Keep going.
So right across the way, we have this big cell phone tower. And, and I've brought up this idea before that's kind of, we could move it from an eyesore to an icon.
Yeah.
So if you let the artistic folks at it,
Yeah.
you have to get it approved by the folks who own it, obviously. Maybe it could be turned into something really cool and artsy.
Like a transformer or something like that. Or something.
I'm not
Why
artistic, so I don't have a clue what, but I'm sure somebody smart could do
Yeah.
something amazing with it.
You know,
Have you seen that treehouse on I-5?
Yeah.
There's a
About,
big,
one,
huge...
about 155th.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That big, huge cell tower that looks like a house up in the air.
really? See, I mean, that's kind of fun. And I would think that, you know, if, as long as it doesn't, you know, interfere with the cell reception or the maintenance of the tower, it's like, sure, why not? They probably just have never been asked, you know? So, sure. Again, minimizing a dagger, absolutely.
So, you know, this is kind of a special occasion. We don't really do this. But we've got a couple people in the audience. Do you guys have any questions? Sure.
Well, you've probably been in lots of big towns, but you know, we're not a huge town, and we're basically a pass-through town that wants to become a destination. And our access to the lake has been, you know, minimized because of,
You've industrialized.
you know, it's not, there's no access yet, but it's coming. Little by little, we have some water access, and we definitely have the Burke-Gilman Trail to help us pull people through that would be part of this walkable idea. Or, you know, if we can build a bridge or a tunnel under the big highway, we might get people over here, right?
Yeah.
But when you think about these small towns, what do you think makes the difference when you think about your heart and soul of the city? We haven't had a heart and soul yet. It's like we're creating that.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the reasons why this is so interesting, is you are creating a psychic center in a place that kind of didn't have one or had kind of diffused centers. But what's actually interesting is I actually do spend a lot of time in smaller towns. In fact, I think the smallest town that I've worked in is like 1,800 people. Wow. New Buffalo, Michigan. And, you know, oh, sorry. Thank you. So the size actually, in some cases, a lot of the stuff that I talk about, I think it actually maybe works in your favor. Because when you do something here, people know. You know, and these co-creators that are here, when they do something, other people see it. And I think ultimately what we really like when we do this kind of stuff is that we feel like it makes a difference. And what we love Seattle. And Seattle's a gorgeous city, very cool. You need to do something about as big as a troll to actually get any sort of attention in Seattle, right? But you could do something a lot smaller here that probably would have, you know, on a per capita basis, like an equal or greater impact than that. And so there is something to be said for these smaller towns. They have, I think, a lot more latitude in terms of the kind of stuff that they can do and trying to get more people in the game. So that to me is why I think smaller towns actually, I think, benefit even more from the type of stuff that I talk about here. So yeah, 20,000. You guys are actually about a medium-sized city compared to, you know, a lot of smaller towns that I actually work with. And I'd still ask, you know, the same kinds of questions, and, you know, want to meet the same kinds of people, no matter what size a city it actually is.
Well, I'm pretty sure if the city started giving away money for creative ideas, we would have a lot of people that participated.
Yeah, but that's not necessarily a sustainable way to do it.
Well, even if we did a big give, and then whoever is the top idea, have it all be private money, but then it becomes this community activity.
Instead of one big gift, if you were to do something like that, I'd say come up with 100 little gifts. Come up with 100 small things that you guys want to do in the city. Because, you know, if you do one big thing, there's going to be a lot, no matter how cool it is, there's going to be people who don't like it. That's not for me. You know, but if you do 100 things, you're going to find there's going to be something in there for everybody in something like that. So instead of thinking like that one big thing, find 100 little things That, I think, actually be a much more interesting thing. And maybe that could even be part of the, of this process. I mean, the fact that you guys are in this building mode right now says, all right, from the time, the village closes till the opening, we'll have, there'll be a 12 to 18-month window of something like that. It says, we're going to do 100 cool little things before this thing ultimately opens there, and challenge our community and say, we're going to do 25% of them. We want the other 3/4, we want the other organizations, we want other businesses, we want the other citizens to sort of step up and do that as well, and be part of the 100 steps to, the town green kind of thing that sort of lead up to that. Cool. All right, we expect you to come up with something.
I've been writing a little list.
Anything else?
I have a question. Anybody on their phone? Does anyone know what the score to the basketball game is? Duke won. I'm a Big Ten guy, and after I was hoping, for a big. What was the final score? It was close. It was. All right. West Coast. All right.
All right. Thanks. So we can wrap this thing up, I think, pretty quickly. Comments, initiatives. Whatever. Let's start with you. Anything?
Actually, can I just do one
yeah,
thing?
Oh, yeah, staff report.
So on the 20th, the council meeting on the 20th of this month, one thing we have on the agenda is just a follow-up discussion to Peter's visit. So we'll go through the workshop tomorrow, and then next Monday, or I guess 2 weeks. Is that right? Yeah. On the 20th. Now I'm all confused. Is it the 13th or the 20th? Yeah, I think it's the 20th is when we'll have a follow-up discussion and next steps and things that we want to put into action or change because of Peter's visit. So we'll do that. Also, I want to thank my coworkers for helping make this whole thing happen. I get back from a conference, and whenever I get back from a conference, my coworkers just run away from me. Like, oh no, he's coming back with all these ideas.
Everybody duck.
Yeah. But, and I said, well, wouldn't it be great if we had Peter come out and talk to the community? Sounds simple enough, right? Well, actually, it's a ton of work. And Leslie and Debbie, they're the producers of this event, of these events. And so there's just tons of work and detail that go behind the scenes that a lot of people don't see. So I just want to thank them, and they're so good at, oh, Rob's got an idea, okay, let's try to make it happen, and all these details that they make fall into place. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Milton, anything?
Nothing to add.
Nothing to add. Thank you.
Nothing to add. Laurie?
Well, thank you. I was just thinking, thank you again for coming, Peter. I know that you travel a lot, and we appreciate that you're willing to come here. I was thinking about your idea of, the 100 things for Kenmore, or whatever number we choose. But wouldn't it be cool to have one of those good news meetings and say we had, 25 or 50 things, and then have all those people stand up and have a wonderful show and tell? Would that be fun to do that? Yeah. I think we have one person supporting that.
I might add that those that are on the staff, many of their staff members are co-creators within this city. They've come up with some excellent ideas. I don't know whether you've seen Hank Herron yet.
I have, yeah.
Yeah. Things like that are just...
I wasn't sure if I was allowed to mention Hank at this point. So, okay, all right, there you go.
Oh, yeah. He's public.
Yeah.
He's public. He's posted at the beginning of the construction project's about ready to start. So, and I thank you for sharing your time with us here in the city of Kenmore.
Thanks, Alan.
And appreciate having you stay with me.
Yeah,
so
it's been fun.
A little one-on-one time. That's good. Thank you.
Stacey?
So thank you again for coming. I was curious, do you want us to be a part of this workshop tomorrow?
I'd love it if you
or
guys would come and sort
just
of
watch?
take off the official hat.
I have many ideas.
Yeah, no, I think you should. I think it'd be a great way for folks to actually interact with you guys in a way that doesn't necessarily feel like you guys are leading the discussion. It's like, hey, look, you're just hanging out. Hey, yeah, we're council, but we're citizens here as well. So yeah, I think it'd be great. Invite your family, invite your kids. I think it would be great if we had some young people in the audience as well. I mean, high school kids. Yeah, because again, they see this very differently than us, and they're going to come up with some different sort of solutions. And it'd be nice to have that energy in the room as well.
Last night I forced my teenage sons to share it on Facebook.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, if the $500 is in, it's going somewhere.
It was 400, but yeah.
And now they have an update, right? Now it's 500.
Oh yeah, good point. Yeah.
So, you may not believe this, but I absolutely have nothing this week. We're going to 192. So, yes, so anybody's welcome to join us.
I haven't had dinner yet.
Peter some
so
dinner,
yeah.
and we're going to...
Proper, I haven't had a food dinner.
You got more.
Just one more thing. I'm contemplating canceling the April 27th City Council meeting, because if you look at the agenda forecast, nothing's on for that night. And so we'll know officially tomorrow, but just to let you know, we're thinking about not having a meeting on the 27th.
To force it.
And with that, we are adjourned.